Kia ora. My name is Megan Balks. I've been a soil scientist working in soil science since way back in the 1980s, where I started with the DSIR Soil Bureau, which is an ancestor of Manaaki Whenua land care research. I taught at the University of Waikato for 30 years in their Earth Sciences department, and during that time I contracted to Manaaki Whenua for work in the Antarctic. After I worked for DSIR Soil Bureau, it was a time when they got greatly restructured, and I moved to the University of Waikato. And Ian Campbell and Graham Claridge, who were some of the original soil scientists that pioneered the Antarctic soil science work, they were made redundant from land care research, but they still had an Antarctic project. And because they knew me, because I'd worked with them, they gave me the opportunity to go with them, because I had access to laboratories and computers and all of those things that they were somewhat cut off from. And so if someone offers you a trip to Antarctica, you say yes. So I in the end had 3 trips to Antarctica with Ian and Graham. Every trip has been fantastic in terms of everyone is different and they're all an adventure. Antarctica is still one of the last great adventures on the planet, and the opportunity to work down there and fly around in helicopters down there is something that money really doesn't buy. And so you're very lucky to have that opportunity. And your first trip is obviously extra special, but after that, I never had a bad trip, and they were all wildly different. We went to different places with a lot of the same people. I had a lot of continuity, but also always a few different people over time. The work that we were doing is hard work. We were studying the soil. We're digging holes, and the Americans used to laugh at us and say we had a D1 bulldozer because we dug them with a pick and shovel. The US always had a lot more money in their programs. They'd have done something more serious. But so we're doing hard, tedious work in the cold. So the real exciting thing was when you got the work done and it was a nice evening, you go walking up the nearest mountain or go walking out on the sea ice to explore the icebergs that are locked in the sea ice, things like that. Those are the real special memories that you remember, those real adventure highlights. And flying in the helicopters, it's a thrill that money doesn't buy, flying around that landscape and being able to look at it. And we were lucky to be able to travel quite a bit around the region for various projects that we were working on. And my first trip to Antarctica was in 1990, and up until then, the work that Ian and Graham had been doing, because they were really the sole Antarctic soil science people, a few from the US, was very much exploratory. It was, what is there? Is there actually soil there? And how does it come to be like it is? And trying to understand the soils in that landscape. In 1990, Ian Campbell had a lot of foresight. He foresaw that the environment was going to become important before it had really started to kick in. The first project I worked with him on was looking at an area where they'd built an airstrip way back in the late 50s, early 60s, and done a lot of disturbance. And so there was areas where the soil had been bulldozed away, it had been cut, or areas where it had been dumped and filled. We looked at how much those soils had recovered, how much the permafrost had adjusted to those changes, how much the ground surface had recovered, how much impact that it had. Because people were looking, you could see places where there's bulldozer tracks in the landscape that were put there in the late 1950s, and by 1990 you could still see exactly where the bulldozer had travelled. So there's this question about it, and a growing awareness of the impacts that humans were having on the environment. So I was there at a time of a switch, and so from then on, all of our work that I was involved with Manaaki Whenua was really related to impacts of humans on the environment. We kind of went through the physical impacts of those disturbances, from the big bulldozing to just walking across the landscape once to back and forth. We also did a lot of work on oil spills. There were old historic sites where they'd done things like take the oil out of a bulldozer and let it just flow out on the ground, and then stick the bung back in and put new oil in. And on those sites, the stuff was still there. And so the question was, what impact is this having? Is there things we can do? The Americans at the time had a policy that any contaminated soil should be dug up and taken away. But in some cases, the impacts of that is going to be bigger than possibly the impact of doing nothing. Or was there a possibility of doing something to help encourage the biodegradation of oil? Also looked at other spills of other things that had happened, things like that. Well, when I first went there, I was somewhat cynical. My first question was is this stuff really soil? And the answer is yes. That was the fascinating thing. And the reason that studying soils in Antarctica, it is very fascinating because although processes are very slow, and the reason that we've got soil in Antarctica is because we're dealing with a desert environment. The evaporation is greater than the precipitation, so we've got these ice-free areas. And some of those landscapes are very old. They're millions of years of surface exposure, which is way, way older than any soil surface in New Zealand, for instance. And so the fascinating thing is to understand those soils in the landscape, and there's still things we could learn about that. But the work we were paid to do was all about the impacts of human activities. So while we were doing one thing, we're kind of wandering around the landscape whenever we get a chance, looking at this wider picture and the bigger questions. The definition of soil used to say it must have biological material and be capable of growing plants or whatever. Ian Campbell and Graham Claridge, I think even in their book, said they used to describe them as sterile. But in reality they're not, and the modern microbial techniques have started to show us that there is actually a whole microbial food chain in the Antarctic soils. And there are a couple of little if you've got really good eyesight, you can occasionally find a tiny little spider mighty creature, a little red guy, and springtails, little jumpy insects. So there is a whole little food chain that gets up that far. Most of the biological activity in Antarctica is associated with the coastline, and the birds and the whole food chain is dependent on the marine environment for their initial food sources. But in the soils, although we don't have a huge amount of organic matter and a big black topsoil like you would expect, the soil process is still operating. And although they happen slowly, and people think temperature is the limitation to them, but in fact, in the summertime, when you've got sun beating down 24 hours a day, the surface of the ground can get up around 20 degrees Celsius. And so for a few weeks every year, the temperature's not limiting. The most limiting thing to all the chemical reactions and all the biological processes is water. And whenever you've got water, you've got life. So anywhere that there was meltwater flowing, the mosses start to grow. You see that life starting to get in there. And even in the rocks, you can find rocks that have got marble, where it lets a little bit of light through and traps a little moisture underneath, and if you turn it over you'll see a little bit of green algae growing on the bottom of the rock where it's just got a little niche that it can survive. So there is life in the soils, and the formal definition, for instance, in the USDA soil taxonomy, they actually changed it to accommodate the soils in Antarctica and moved their legal definition or their formal definition away from requiring biological activity in any large-scale sense. For me, the most interesting thing is really just that, starting to understand the landscape. And that's a personal thing. Some of it is me discovering what's already been discovered before, and I think you find every generation of scientists to some degree has to reinvent the wheel of what their predecessors already knew. When you're working in the Antarctic, it's cost. The government's paying for this. It's cost a huge amount of money to get you down there. The logistic support and things in Antarctica is very expensive. And it always used to worry me because I felt like, we're doing this tiny little bit of study, working away, digging these few holes and sampling these few soils. But in hindsight, what I've discovered is that a lot of the work we did was much more important than I thought it was at the time. A lot of it's been highly cited, which is one of the measures of scientific success, I suppose. But it was developing an understanding of a lot of the mechanisms in the soil, what's going on in this environment that's quite unique in a global sense. And so there's lots of little things that we found that all add up to a huge increase in our understanding of the way that the soil moisture and the temperatures are behaving. The Ross Sea region, it's a desert environment. It's very cold, it's very stable. It's a long way, the mean annual temperature is a long way below zero. So it's not about to melt madly. We're going to have a huge increase in temperature. And the actual environment in the 30 years or so since I first went down, and before that, Ian and Graham going right back to the early 60s, my perception is it has not changed greatly. We sometimes see, some active processes. Every now and then you get a summer that's a bit warmer and you get a lot more melting, and you suddenly see erosion happening and such like things. But if you look, you can see that those things have happened before too. It's not necessarily that it's new, it's just something that just happens occasionally. But the interesting thing, a few years ago, some guys were travelling way down south where Shackleton walked to the pole, and they retook they went to the sites he'd been, and he'd taken photos back in 1910, and they retook some of those photos. And what they saw was that environment had not changed. The ice, you get snow patches lying around in the summer, exactly the same snow patch 100 years later, still sitting there, hasn't got bigger or smaller. The boulders don't move. We've done work where we've gone back and looked at sites that with old photos from the late 50s, early 1960s, and we've looked at them 30 or 40 years later, and again, nothing has moved. Every stone is still sitting on the surface in the same place. So you don't see a lot of evidence of any major rapid changes. Some things have changed a lot and other things haven't changed much at all. The reality is, if you're studying soils, you have to dig holes, and out in the field, a long way from anywhere, the basic tool is a pick and shovel, and that's what we used. It's what I've got a photo from the Discovery Hut from Captain Scott from 1910 with his pick and shovel, and still today you need those basic tools. But the things that have changed hugely are the communication technology. Things like, it used to be you were out there with a radio that may or may not work depending on how much solar flare activity is going on in the upper atmosphere and so on. Now you can use an iridium phone or a satellite phone and talk to your friends at home anytime you like. We've got internet connection even out in the field now, which you'd certainly never had in 1990 when I went down. So that sort of technology has changed. And the other huge change, I think, for the science has been the sort of area of science where I'm working, is the advances in the biological sciences with all the DNA and so on. Originally, the most you could do was culture the microbes in a totally artificial environment, so only a few of the ones that might have lived in Antarctic will survive that process, and so you're very limited about what you can see. Where now, of course, with the DNA analysis, we know we've got huge microbial biodiversity in these soils that they used to describe as sterile, because to all intents and purposes they couldn't see any sign of biological life in them. In terms of questions, I think the monitoring that we're doing for the soil climate, watching the changes in the active layer, that's the depth that it freezes and thaws every year, and in the permafrost, I think it's really important to continue that so we can see what changes over time and get a stronger feel for how much is between season variability and how much is a long-term change or trend. The other thing that I think is really interesting, our work's all been about impacts of human activity, but there is some very basic understanding that work that Ian and Graham were doing years ago about understanding the soils and the landscapes. We haven't got to the end of that, and particularly the harder to get to areas, some of the very high surfaces right down on the margins of the polar plateau. These are extremely ancient surfaces that have been exposed for millions of years, and the soils are more developed than anywhere else. They are extremely salty, they are highly weathered, and very hard to study because of the logistics to get to them. We've had a tiny little look, limited by very difficult, it's high altitude, helicopter access is difficult and very short time available, and not really had much chance to look at them at all. But I think there's some fascination in understanding more about those soils, how those processes are working, how much variability there is across the landscape in those real extreme regions. And it's the extreme age that's part of the fascination. And the guys who are studying Mars have done work down in the dry valleys as the closest analogue on Earth to Mars, and those really high distant soils are probably, in terms of something that's interplanetary, that's as close as we get. Not much influence of biological activity, but the chemical and physical processes are happening. The thing that I'm proudest of, actually, is not one moment. Science is kind of more cumulative than that. You're a very lucky scientist if you get a big eureka moment. Most of the time it's tedious, hard work that all just incrementally helps build that understanding and knowledge. But the thing that I guess I'm proudest of is the work that my graduate students have done. It was one of the things that kept me involved in Antarctica long after the novelty of going there was wearing off, and I would have quite liked a summer holiday, was that opportunity to give students a chance to experience the environment, to contribute to the science down there. And I've had quite a large number of students worked on a big range of projects, from soil mapping in amongst the penguin colonies through the dry valleys, studies of things like the impacts of the ephemeral streams, where you get a little bit of meltwater flowing and stopping, and what that's doing to the margins of the soil, the work on environmental impacts of oil spills and other disturbances, and those, working with those students to put together and take that work is really the thing that I think's been the special part of the work for me. The real fun thing is going exploring in the middle of the night. After you've done your day's work, the temptation is to spend all night out walking, but you start getting sleep deprivation after a while. You have to be careful about that. But one night, me and a guy we were working with walked up the top of this mountain called East Beacon, quite a long way south. It's a magnificent view, and we get there at 1 o'clock in the morning. We get to the top of this hill, and it's just this little flat platform with the most unbelievable drops of hundreds of metres off the sides. And I've got a photo somewhere of me doing a cartwheel on the top of this mountain, being very careful to keep away from those edges, because it was going to be not a good outcome if we fell off the edge. But sometimes I show that photograph upside down, so I'm clinging on, stop falling off the bottom of the world. And so that was one really special, night out in the environment that stands out for me. It's been a real privilege to work in Antarctica. It's something that lots of people aspire to, and not everyone gets the opportunity. And it's this irony that, having been there once, it gets much easier to get back because you have the experience and the knowledge and so on. And so I guess the work has been fascinating, and it's given me unbelievable opportunities to get involved with other Antarctic researchers from all over the world, and that's been quite special. I've got friends everywhere, from Russia to the United States to across Europe and other places through my Antarctic work. People I've worked with in the Antarctic, as well as people who are also studying similar things in other places. But the real special thing is being out in that environment, right out in the wild, staying in a camp away from most other human activity. You can feel like you're walking where no one has ever walked before, and you've got the vast landscape. It's very hard to judge distances because it's so big, and the huge silence, and no sounds of human activity at all, and it's that opportunity to experience that wonderful landscape which is really the thing that I cherish. Well, when I first went to Antarctica, I was a little bit cynical that we were going down there to study soil. And so the first question was really, is there really such a thing? And I very quickly discovered there was, which was somewhat to my surprise. I was asked to come and help with an existing project, and so I didn't necessarily rush down there with a whole lot of questions, because it's terra incognito. Until you've been there a few times, you don't even know what questions to ask. But I was there at an interesting time, because up until that time, all the research had just been about exploring the environment, discovering what was there. And in relation to the soils, the different parts of the landscape, why were these differences? There are huge differences between soils in different places, mainly related to how old they are, to some degree to what the parent materials are. But the change was a move to concern about the environment, and Ian Campbell had quite a lot of foresight in that he saw that this was where the world was going to go, and that we should be getting concerned about impacts of human activity on the environment. And so my very first trip, we were looking at physical disturbance where areas had been bulldozed maybe 30 or 40 years earlier, and in the very early stages of Antarctic exploration in the 1950s and early 60s, and looking at where stuff had been moved and how much that soil had recovered from those disturbances, and how much the underlying permafrost, what was happening to the water and the ice within the soil, and as a result of those disturbances. And so gaining an understanding of that, and that led on into a whole lot of other aspects of impacts of human activity, which was the main focus of the work I've been involved with. But the real interesting thing is that was what we were paid to do. But what is really fascinating is that trying to understand these fascinating, unusual, different soils and the environment that they're in. It's very hard to see the future. But I'm very aware of the huge cost of, for the logistic cost of being in Antarctica, for the little bit of work you can manage to actually do. It's, those samples have cost a lot. They're very valuable. And I'm hopeful that I'm really delighted that they're being archived and curated and kept, because you never know what's going to come up in the future. And for instance, one of my former PhD students at the moment has a project where she's looking at the microplastics. And so the opportunity perhaps in times to come to look at things that have got into the soil and compare them with some of those samples that were taken, and going back through as far as Ian Campbell and Graham Claridge's samples that go right back into the early 60s. You've got a whole historic record there, and the opportunity potentially to maybe go and resample and do comparisons, those sorts of things. Also, different people with different perspectives can use those samples to save some future costs of getting back to some of those places and build a wider database on which they can base whatever research they're doing.